Diane Winston is a star. Okay, actually, I'm tempted just to sit down. But, she holds the Knight Chair in Media and Religion at the University of Southern California, college for the boy and girl who has everything. She's a former religion reporter and received her PhD from Princeton University, where you wrote on American evangelicalism. Her monographs and edited collections include Writing the American Dream, How the Media Mainstreamed Reagan's Evangelical Vision, Religion and Reality TV, Faith in Late Capitalism, and Small Screen, Big Picture Television, and Lived Religion. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Christian Science Monitor, and the Baltimore Sun, among other media outlets. God loves you, but God will love you more if you buy her book. Okay? So please join me in welcoming Diane Winston.
Whoa, thank you, Father Massa. Thank you, Maddie, my new best friend, which is a lot, because several of my best friends are already here. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for your patience. It's not only winter time here in Boston for a Los Angeles person. It's also made me realize I'm glad I have my own car so I don't have to rely on Uber. So thank you all for waiting for me and for being so patient. Okay. A priest, well, no, I won't say a priest. I'll say a pastor and a politician wound up at the pearly gates, waiting to see what came next. All of a sudden, can everyone hear me? St. Peter came walking towards them and said, "Let me show you to your new digs." And they were so happy because, they wanted to see where they're going to spend eternity. So they start walking and they get to a very modest bungalow, and St. Peter turns to the pastor and says, "This is your new home, Father." And he said, "Oh, thank you, it's great, I'm so happy to be here." So the politician's heart starts beating, because if the pastor is getting this very modest place, what is going to happen to him? So they keep walking and walking and walking, and in the distance the politician sees a huge mansion. And as they get closer, he sees apple orchards and gardens and a beautiful patio, and there are horses. And he's thinking, oh my gosh, the Pope must live here. Well, as they're just at the edge of the property, St. Peter turns to him and says, "My son, this is for you." And the politician does a double take and he says, "It's for me. The pastor only got a little shack. Why am I getting this?" And St. Peter said, "Well, we see a lot of pastors, but you're the first politician we've ever seen." Now, I've embellished that joke, but that's a Ronald Reagan joke. And I like to tell it because it reminds us that Reagan did have a knack for telling amusing stories. He had a knack for a few other things, which I'll talk about later. But he also was a deeply faithful man. Oh, this was supposed to go with that story. Joke. What you see here is a letter, a handwritten letter from the White House that Reagan wrote to his father-in-law, Loyal Davis. He wrote to Loyal because Davis was very sick, and it didn't look like he had much longer to live. And he was an atheist, and Reagan was extremely worried about him. And the letter urges Davis to accept Christ. Reagan notes the power of prayer and says God's saving grace is available if only Davis would ask. And I want to quote here. "We have been promised that all we have to do is ask God in Jesus' name to help when we have done all we can, when we've come to the end of our strengths and abilities. And we'll have that help. We only have to trust and have faith in His infinite goodness and mercy. We've been promised this is only part of life, and that a greater life, a life of glory, awaits us. All that is required is that you believe and tell God you put yourself in His hands." I am citing this letter to establish that Reagan was a man of faith. He grew up in the church and he taught Sunday school. He admired Christian books about faith, and many of his childhood friends expected him to go into the ministry. Like many of us, his faith changed over time, and it wasn't in his later years, especially in the White House, bound to an institution. During these years in the White House, many reporters questioned whether he was a Christian and claimed that his religiosity was a pretext, a way to win Christian votes. Now, it's true, Reagan sought and received endorsements from conservative Christians, but it was not simply a transactional relationship. He was a believer, and many, if not most of his policies were expressions of his faith. Now, I'd like to show you another president who also calls himself a Christian and whose policies express a faith which I will discuss later on. So the question is, how did we get to from the Reagan Revolution to the Trump insurrection? And to explain this shift, I want to focus on the American religious imaginary. A social imaginary is made up of the values, expectations, laws, and institutions that help us understand or imagine our social location as individuals and as members of a society. These are the ways that, quote, people imagine their social existence, how they fit together with others, how things go on between them and their fellows, and the expectations that are normally met. The philosopher whose words are there, Charles Taylor, was interested in how ordinary people imagine their social surroundings. A social imaginary is important because it provides societies with common practices and a shared sense of legitimacy. Taylor hypothesized that imaginaries were not just communicated through words, but more importantly, more powerfully, through stories, images, legends, myths, and symbols. Take a breath, literally take a breath, close your eyes, and let everything bouncing around in your head go for a second. Let go of the Gaza war, the upcoming election, your growing to-do list. Forget about income inequality, systemic racism, and global policing. Also, Ubers that go in the wrong direction. Take another breath and imagine what it means to be an American. What has that meant to you? What you want it to mean? What you hope it can mean? Now open your eyes. Anybody brave enough to tell this whole room what you imagined when you thought of what it means to be an American?
Not me. Diane, let me put this down a little bit. Perfect, thank you.
I did this at UC Santa Barbara, and people were willing to tell me what they thought of being American. So thank you. What kind? Oh no, it has to be positive.
It has to be positive.
I'd like it to be positive.
To be in struggle with like-minded people.
That's good. Yeah.
To fight for real justice.
Fight for real
And
justice.
in the world.
That's excellent. Anyone else want to try? Boy, you're a tough crowd. Ideally, we as American citizens have similar imaginaries. And these shared assumptions provide a foundation that makes up our social, political, and economic order. And yes, it has to do with fighting for justice. It has to do with whatever feelings we have about the flag. It has to do with our idea of the Marlboro man, the cowboy on the frontier. It's a whole mix of things that make up our constellation of what it means to be an American. A religious imaginary is a type of social imaginary. It is made up of the religious, spiritual, moral, and ethical values, symbols, and beliefs that provide us with meaning, identity, and purpose. So just as the social imaginary gives us a sense of who we are as Americans, the religious imaginary gives us a higher sense of who we are as members of this country, but also people who feel that attachment in a deeper sense than just mere citizenry. A religious imaginary is more than supernatural creatures, religious institutions, church doctrine, or dogma. It reflects the economic, social, and political values that arise from our common understandings. It's a shared orientation to daily life that reflects a higher purpose. And it is enacted through everyday life. Who we elect, where we put our money, how we raise our children. In other words, it is that moral, spiritual, religious compass that directs us in the very basic decisions that we make every day. Our most fundamental religious imaginary as American citizens is that we are a chosen nation, a city on a hill, a New Jerusalem, a God-blessed country. It expresses a sense of providential destiny that runs from the first colonists to the Revolutionary era, to the Civil War, 2 world wars, the moon landing, and our emergence as a superpower. But it's not the only religious imaginary. It can coexist with others. Martin Luther King's beloved community, Robert Bella's civil religion, the Golden Land, early 20th century Jewish immigrants. All these are religious imaginaries that work with that basic imaginary that we are a chosen nation. So now I'm going to let you in on a little secret. You already probably know that academics like fancy words. Someone referred to them recently to me as posh words. And imaginary is definitely one of them. It may be simpler to think of the imaginary as a narrative we tell ourselves to make sense of the world, but with pictures. Imaginaries aren't stagnant, they grow and change. For example, the fundamental American religious imaginary, the US is a chosen nation, shifts between poles of individualism and communitarianism, between progressivism and regressivism. When Reagan was elected in 1980, the dominant religious imaginary was breaking down. That imaginary had been shaped by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who advanced a communitarian vision of brotherhood, religious tolerance, and social welfare. According to this religious imaginary, God blessed America, and the blessing was for a good society, one with a strong federal government that supported the needy, prized religious pluralism and tolerance. But by the end of the 70s, that religious imaginary was failing. Everything from the counterculture to the Vietnam War, factory closings, and recession suggested that God's blessing was gone. Archie Bunker, a stereotype symbolic of the times, wondered what happened to his American dream and blamed, and I'm quoting him, spics, homos, and heaves, and such people for messing it up. Similarly, televangelists like Jerry Falwell blame many of the same people, but called them gays and feminists. When President Jimmy Carter ran for re-election in 1980, he called for sober reflection on who we were as a nation. His Republican opponent promised to make America great again. Guess who won? Beginning with the promise to make America great again, Reagan rejiggered the American religious imaginary to fit his own evangelically informed vision. It was informed by 3 things: his Christian beliefs, his belief in American exceptionalism, and his notion of a biblical city on a hill. In Matthew 5:14, Jesus warns his disciples that the world will judge whether they, a symbolic city on a hill, are faithful to his teachings. When Reagan added the word shining to the phrase a city on a hill, he flipped the original meaning, which was a call to radical discipleship. Instead, he sanctified American exceptionalism. Reagan's religious imaginary, and let me be clear, this was never a term he would have used himself, was rooted in the conviction that God bless America. And the apex of that blessing was individual freedom. that freedom needed to be expressed economically, politically, and religiously. Free markets, limited government, and the freedom to publicly express your religious beliefs. Now think about that. We normally think of religious people wanting to do social things, stop an abortion, get prayer back in school. What I'm saying to you is that's not where Reagan's head was at. He wanted to make his religious beliefs about economics and politics. And socially, it wasn't that he was opposed to ending abortion, but he thought it was more important that religious people should be able to say what they felt in the public square. And what we call that today is religious liberty. The idea that if you don't want to serve someone because they're gay, you don't have to serve them. These beliefs were in line with long-standing conservative perspectives. After the 1917 Russian Revolution, conservative business, political, and religious leaders agreed that the Soviet Union was an existential threat because it denied all three freedoms: economic, religious, and political. Over the next few decades, they spread their concerns through local churches, business groups, women's networks, radio programs, and reading matters. This is significant because most people think Christian nationalism and the Christian right began with Reagan, Jerry Falwell, John Birch. I'm saying it began in 1917. I'm taking it all the way back to the Russian Revolution because that's when I think Americans really first became extremely worried about the threat of communism and saw the need to protect Christian capitalist perspectives. When Reagan was elected in 1980, these Americans championed him, even as many others clung to the FDR-era imaginary. So how did Reagan get the support of the millions of Americans who believed in the welfare state, compassionate liberalism, and a religion-free public square? Well, he improved the economy. That's basically bottom line, he improved the economy. But he also used the news media to shift the narrative, to shift the imaginary, to tell a different story. Reagan's economic policies remained contentious, but people vote their pocketbooks. Many Democrats did in 1984. That's a fact. But the Reagan Revolution wasn't just about economics. It was also a shift in perspectives in which the news media played a significant role. I'm going to give you a quick example of what I mean, and we can return to it in the question and answers. In 1980, the news media was nothing like it is today. First of all, people trusted it. Moreover, everyone got their news from the same sources. There were local and regional newspapers. The Wall Street Journal was the only national paper then. There were news magazines like Time and Newsweek, and there were 3 main television networks. Yes, there were alternatives. There was the religious press, there was the foreign language press, there were highly partisan news outlets, but these were all small and siloed. Unlike today's media landscape where everyone can find niche news that confirms their beliefs, the 80s media operated on the lowest common denominator. It needed to appeal to the widest possible audience. And as a result, journalists were careful about what they said and how they said it. Journalists in the 80s had other reasons to be careful. Americans were tired of the crusading journalism of the 1970s. They were dispirited by a decade of bad news, and their habits were changing. TV had replaced print news, afternoon papers were dying, and hyper-local suburban weeklies were growing. Americans wanted snappier, happier news, epitomized by USA Today, which debuted in September 1982. The paper's colorful spreads and upbeat tone synced with Reagan's politics of hope and sunny optimism. I'd also argue that USA Today's initial success motivated other publishers to take a kinder, gentler approach to politics and the powerful. This benefited the Reagan administration, and in my book, I argue that newspapers normalized Reagan's religious imaginary when they circulated his speeches, press conferences, and interviews. News outlets also normalize ideas through repetition and through professional choices. Who's interviewed? What's the focus? What verbs, adverbs, and adjectives move the story forward? To demonstrate what I mean, let's look at the story that helped normalize Reagan's use of the term evil as a geopolitical description. In March 1983, at the height of the nuclear freeze movement, Reagan appeared at the National Association of Evangelicals. The freeze was a response, an international response to the escalation of the US-USSR arms race, which under Reagan was escalating. Millions of Americans signed petitions, joined protests calling for an end to nuclear testing, nuclear production, and the deployment of nuclear weapons. But Reagan's policy was peace through strength, and his strategy was increased defense spending. He hated nukes, but he believed a freeze would benefit the Soviet Union. In March 1983, when Reagan gave that speech, his popularity was at a low ebb. The economy had not recovered from a 10-year slump, and religious conservatives, his core supporters, were angry that abortion was still legal and school prayer was not. His chances for a second term looked very dim. In this speech, Reagan noted his administration's achievements, celebrated American freedom, and praised God's blessing. Oh, he also started the speech with the joke I told you. Then he uttered these words referring to the Soviet people. Yes, let us pray for the salvation of all those who live in that totalitarian darkness. Pray that they will discover the joy of knowing God. But until they do, let us be aware that while they preach the supremacy of the state, declare its omnipotence over individual man, and predict the domination of all people on earth, they are the focus of evil in the modern world. The Evil Empire speech, as it's commonly called, is one of the most famous speeches in presidential history. It interests me because it raised a geopolitical conflict into a cosmic battle between good and evil. Now, in their initial stories, reporters focused on the freeze and what Reagan said or didn't say about it. But subsequent editorials and stories homed in on this notion of an evil empire, as Reagan called it. And even as editorials may have mocked the president, they kept his language and ideas in the news. And the notion of the evil empire reverberated throughout the year as Reagan threatened and excoriated the Soviet Union in other situations. After all, what do you call an enemy who threatens you that is totally evil? In 1983, the year I focus on, Reagan and his surrogates used the news media to mainstream other policies that arose from his religious imaginary. We can return to this in the Q&A, but just for a teaser, I'll say they found domestic evils that threatened individual responsibility, the heterosexual family, and democracy itself. Bottom line, Reagan's religious imaginary, which hallowed individual freedom, market capitalism, and limited government, in other words, the right of free people to make as much money as possible with as few regulations and restrictions as possible, replaced the democratic welfare state with a market-based orientation that some call neoliberalism. A neoliberalism sheathed in religion to justify its excesses. In the 36 years since Reagan left office, our nation's market orientation has crept even further into our politics and economics and into our very understanding of ourselves and our world, and to our imaginaries. Social media markets us. Job seekers brand themselves. And dating apps can turn romance into transactions. It's led to an epidemic of loneliness, a laissez-faire attitude to climate change, staggering economic inequality, and voters who see no difference between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. Trump is a preacher of the markets, the embodiment of individual freedom taken to its extreme. And today's news media has helped to normalize his words and ideas. Statements and behaviors that were once deemed deviant, malicious, and mendacious have become commonplace. But you don't have to take my word for it. This is from a recent article by journalist Lucian Truscott, and I'm quoting. Donald Trump, in speaking about the issue of immigration, has inserted eugenics and his belief in the superiority of the white race into the campaign. The New York Times published a story on Wednesday, I think that was a week ago, about recent speeches Trump gave when he spoke about, I think you're dying to know what he spoke about, when he spoke about good genes and bad genes, and called it, in the story's lead paragraph, another old habit of Trump's. What the New York Times did in that story was to normalize Trump's white supremacy and cruelty. They normalized Trump even as they quoted him saying to what the Times called, Trump was speaking to a substantially white crowd. Trump said, "You have good genes. A lot of it is about the genes, isn't it? Don't you believe the racehorse theory?" And I'm still quoting Truscott. These are the words of a white supremacist, a believer in the same theories Hitler used to justify the extermination of Jews and others with undesirable genes. The Time wrote off Trump's use of Hitler's phrase, quote, poisoning the blood of our country. Hitler used that and Trump used it to describe undocumented immigrants by quoting Trump's claim that he is not a student of Hitler. That is what it means to normalize someone's speech. What is normalization? If you're a Trump supporter, you believe immigrants are eating dogs because you've heard it so often. If you're not a Trump supporter, you don't believe it, but the charge has been integrated into your daily routine. That's what media scholars mean when they say the news does not tell you what to think. The news isn't going to tell you what to think, but it will tell you what to think about. You're thinking about immigrants eating dogs, even when you know they don't. Does Trump have a religious imaginary? His only conviction seems to be self-aggrandizement. If he has a religious imaginary, I'd call it nihilistic apocalypticism. Nothing has any value, so let's blow it all up and begin Trumpism's 1,000-year reign. I am not, nor was I ever, a Reagan supporter. I was devastated when he was elected. Now, in retrospect, I think it marked a horrific turning point for the nation. But Reagan was, I believe, a decent person who believed in democracy and thought he was acting in the best interests of his country. I'd like to think that he never imagined his belief in individual freedom had only one inevitable end. But I hope you can see the path that led from one to the other, from Trump to Reagan. And the irony is, I don't think Reagan would have been at all happy with this ending. So, obviously, I have my own political perspectives. I should have began by saying that this was a polemical speech to some extent. If you don't agree with me, that's fine. I'd love to hear your questions, comments, and we can talk more about imaginaries, about the news media, and if you think Trump is going to bring in 1,000 years of greatness, go for it. Thank you.
We had Robbie Jones last week from PRI, who's a very smart commentator.
Yep.
He gave statistics that show that the majority of Christian nationalists today do not belong to church. Oh, sorry. I'm being a bad. Okay.
We had Robbie Jones at WASI last week from PRI, which is an important data gathering center. And he showed that the majority of Christian nationalists today are not church members. And the majority might even say that they don't define themselves as religious. So the difference then between Reagan and what's happening now seems to involve much more of an emphasis on race, not violence. So the social imaginary has changed rather dramatically from Reagan's idea of trying to offer some sort of unified civil religion to where we are today, where the two parties, and there are many parties actually, the Green Party and so forth, have very different social imaginaries. How do you explain that 40-year, I mean, did the entire civil religion collapse between Reagan and Trump? What is going on? Where we are now is different than what was going on in 1980 when Reagan was elected. How do you explain that?
In 1980, we were still living under FDR's vision, which was a welfare state. It wasn't a perfect welfare state. A lot of people were left out of it, especially people of color. But we did have this idea we're all in it together. I think Reagan's religious imaginary, which focused on individualism, was, to me, the beginning of the end. And so we became more of a society that valued individual rights rather than communal bonds and obligations. Now, I think any society has to balance the two. If you want to have a democratic society, you need to have individual freedom, but I think you must also have a sense of communal responsibility. And I believe that Reagan did not have that. I have a lot of feelings about why that is that have to do with the Protestant predominance in this country and Protestant theology, which I won't go into now. I could talk about, but I do think that it has a lot to do with the orientation we have as a country, which is quite Protestant. I think that this idea of individualism just took off in the 80s with once the economy began to recover. It's when you have like Milliken and all those wolves of Wall Street basically screwing with people's livelihoods and getting as much money as they can. And I think gradually, it's just undercut our whole sense of national cohesion, to the point where people today, feel resentful because they don't have what they see other people having. They think someone else is to blame, and they think, they should be able to get whatever what they want, and they're hoping Trump gives it to them.
So on one level then, you see the election in 3 weeks as being a choice between American individualism and American community?
I don't think it's that stark, but I think Kamala Harris at least represents the hope that we can find more social solidarity and that we can remember the people who have been left behind. I don't think she's going to turn back the clock. We're not in a position in this country right now to have a New Deal, however that would look, but I think she will try, as Biden has tried, to find ways to, help people who were devastated by the pandemic, to help people who are really financially underwater, to help relieve student debt. I mean, all these things that Trump does not want to support, she will support. And again, she's not the second coming, but she at least has some sense of solidarity with other people.
Questions?
Come on, didn't I make anyone mad enough to want to fight with me?
Thank you so much. Is this, flip it up. Hello, there we go. Thank you so much. I'm really interested in this intersection of religion and kind of the far right, and I think this religious imaginary is a really helpful framework for kind of accessing that kind of very complex relationship there. I was wondering if you could speak about the role you see of the history of emotion playing into this, right? The role, the extent to which there's this kind of psychological affective payout to this religious dimension, kind of the cathartic belief, as you said, the millionairism, that kind of thing, this belief in putting faith as a very kind of emotional way of voting or believing in a political movement.
You're asking me if the religious imaginary, which is as much about feeling as it is about intellect,
Exactly, yeah. I was wondering if you could just talk about just like this creation of norms and expectations. Wondering to what extent that's kind of inherently kind of an affective role as well, in addition to kind of one being about logic, right?
I think it's fair to say that most people operate from an emotional perspective rather than an intellectual one. And I think that the religious imaginary gives us an emotional basis for believing what our country is doing is usually the right thing to be doing. The question for me is whether we think what we think the country should be doing, which is sort of it. And I think that's where the emotional perspective comes in. Because you may believe we all may agree that America is a chosen nation or a special place. We could put it in different terms, or it's, the lodestar of democracy. But we have emotional feelings about what does that mean? Does that mean we set a standard of compassion and care and social welfare? Does it mean we make sure we can police the world for democracy? Does it mean that we privilege one group or another? And I think these are emotional decisions that come out of people's personal location. Does that sort of answer what you're asking?
Awesome, yeah, thank you so much, I appreciate it.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. So given Trump's eugenic and white supremacist rhetoric, as you spoke about, I think you mentioned this a little, but just Trump's espousal of ideas that I think previously most American people would have found pretty abhorrent, what do you think are some of the reasons that informs his mass popularity and gain in popularity now? Because years ago, with the talk about, for example, the immigrants eating dogs, I think most American people would think that's ridiculous. And now there's millions of people saying, oh, he's right. And everything Trump says is canon and it's absolutely correct. And I was wondering if you think there's maybe a fundamental lack of knowledge or a shift in the views of American people in that sense. Like, what do you think are some of the reasons for his gain in popularity given that?
I think there are a few explanations. I think the one explanation is economic. The economic inequality in this country has been so great that and people know what they don't have because they see it all the time. So I think that's one answer. People want more and they think Trump is going to give it to them. I think there's a lot of white resentment to people of color, the great replacement theory. Interestingly, everybody knows what I mean when I say that. This is nothing new. A friend of mine did an ethnographic study in the 1960s and 70s in a white community in Atlanta, and he found most of the very low income white people had the same replacement theory, that people of color were replacing them, that we hear about today. And so it seems to me that if this goes back to the 60s, it probably goes back a lot further. And there has been generations upon generations of poor whites who think that they are being replaced by people of color. And Trump was able to capitalize on that in a way that no one else really has. I think that's sort of an economic, social reason. I think another reason is the news media. I think that, I said in the 80s we had dominant media. That's both good and bad. It was good because we all were speaking the same language and having the same debates, but the media was pretty much run by, I sound like a broken record here, but by white men. And so we didn't have a lot of diversity of perspectives and we had one sort of main view. Today you can get any kind of media you want, whatever you could be I won't even try to imagine the intersectionality of it, but you could be anyone and find media that reflects your perspective. And they're siloed, so people aren't speaking to each other. That's a really interesting thing too, because one of the reasons that's true is that Reagan in the second second term got rid of the Fairness Act. The Fairness Act, as some of you probably know, made broadcast programs have 2 points of view on every show. So if you brought in a pro-abortion person, a pro-choice person, you'd have to also have a not pro-choice person. You always had to have a balance. Reagan got rid of that. That directly led to talk radio, which led to Fox News and all the other outlets online on its broadcast that today have polarized our country into at least 2 different worlds. So that's another thing. People have been listening to one or another sort of news that the other side seems like, totally off base. So between normalization through very different news, between, economic inequality, between people in our country feeling they are left behind, I think all of these have to do with why Trump has such a stronghold today. And also, the Democrats have not been very sophisticated or savvy about trying to stop him. They've not had consistent messages. When I was reporting in the 1980s in the South, members of the nascent religious right said to me, we're going to take over this country piece by piece, and we're starting locally, and we're going to take over county commissions and school boards, we'll take over state government, and we're going to go all the way up. When I said that to people I know up north, they thought I lost my mind, because how could these crazy people ever take over anything? Well, they had a concerted strategy to do so that also had a very savvy media piece. So nothing has ever gone on in moderate or progressive circles to match that.
I was thinking about when you were talking about FDR and the welfare society, and now from Reagan on, the individual freedom. Can that trajectory, do you think, ever be reversed? Increased fragmentation, how might that, you say Kamala Harris is of that ilk, but not enough. What, in your mind, would be a point that would change this direction? Which seems, I don't know how, once you're on to the individualism track, I don't know how you get off of it.
Well, there's a lot of young people and older people who are quite to the left who believe if we let Trump win, the society will basically implode, and we will be able to be on a different track. That's one scenario. I don't know how you feel, because when I was in college and graduate school, I never would have said this, but I almost am beginning to come around to the great man theory. I think one person can make a very big difference if they can capture the national mood, and I think FDR did that, I think Reagan did that, I think Trump is doing that. I was hoping Barack Obama would have done that. I started this book in 2012 because I thought Barack Obama was going to bring in a new way of being together as a nation. But in 2016, I realized I had to sort of change the way I was looking at things, because Trump was much more successful than he was at changing, at grabbing the zeitgeist and using it to his advantage. So I think the right person could do it. I think, if we were able to organize different movements to come together and work together, whether they were trade union movements or labor unions or feminists or whomever, everyone, but it doesn't seem like that is likely to happen. Plus, it's hard now. It's not just a problem of individualism, it's a problem of corporate control of so much of our country that we're not even aware of. I think there's a deep state, but it's not the same deep state as Trump thinks. It's a deep state of private equity and hedge funds and Wall Street tyros. So I think this keeps me up at night. Because I have a child and I worry about the world that's going to come, she's going to inherit, and I wish I knew how we could affect change more successfully. I want to tell you a quick story that you reminded me of, what I mean by news media and how things were colluded on in the 80s. I was covering the Pope in 87, and, oh no, that's not the story I want to tell. I want to tell a story about a colleague of mine who was working at Time magazine in 1980. And he went to the head of the publication at that point, the head of Time magazine, and he asked him, how should I cover the Reagan campaign? And the head of Time magazine said to him, we have destroyed the last 3 presidents. We did the media. We destroyed Nixon, we destroyed Ford, and we destroyed Carter. I think we should give this one a break. And I think that was a lot of the feeling in the news media and part of why they went so soft on Reagan. So I think that's the other thing we have to deal with, that we forget that most of the media is corporate media. And so they're going to be presenting the world to you in a way that's beneficial to corporate America. And that's a problem too, because we always complain about Fox News media and the left, but our news media, in its own way, is just as one-sided as the other side's news media.
Trump sold newspapers, right? I mean, did that happen?
Yes, Trump sold, yes, when he went out of office, I think it was Leslie Moonves, the head of CBS, who was saying, yeah, we didn't like Trump, but he sure got people watching.
So the first question about emotion helped me think of this question, which is the story that I hear you make the case for is that the connection is this radical individualism, atomization of neoliberalism introduced by Reagan, and that's the through line that leads to Trump. So an observation is that if you're in MAGA world, there's a lot of emotional fusion. There's not a sense of individualism. There's a sense of mass solidarity, and you get, I see you nodding, so I don't need to try to explain any further. My question is, what's the connection? How do you draw the connection between something so atomistic and individualized as neoliberalism, as Reagan introduced it? How does that lead to that kind of fusion, mass, emotional connection, where there doesn't seem to be individuality in it?
That is such a great question. That could be a really good article. I think it's a both and question, because it's, life is hardly ever either or. So I think you could be looking at the world very individualistically, like what am I going to do, what am I going to get, how do I not be replaced, yet still find solidarity with people who feel the same way you do. So I don't think it's that, I think there's probably a great relief in realizing that there are millions of other people who feel as dispossessed, as unheard, as unseen as you do. And it's not like you're pledging that you're going to raise everyone up, in fact, you're saying from the first, well, these people don't have good genes, so I'm not going to care about them. Right. And these people are, stupid, so I'm not going to care about them. And these people are, causing the weather to have hurricanes, so we're not going to care about them. So, you have a finite group that you can feel solid with. This is off the top of my head, but I think it's a really interesting question.
Yeah, my question is, I agree with a lot of what you said about rugged individualism, but I think the seeds of it are long before Reagan. I think the seeds of it are actually in a capitalist system that we live in, which has just, over my lifetime, gotten worse and worse and worse in terms of greed, in terms of a lot you can say about the capitalist system, and it's like eating itself. It's getting more and more like that. So I see the roots of individualism in many other places, but I particularly see it in the system we live in, which is why I can't look at a great man theory, because again, that's one individual in the face of a system that I see as totally broken in so many ways that a Trump can emerge. So I wonder what you think about kind of the roots, to me, aren't Reagan, they're well before that.
I think a lot of historians say that, individualism is kind of an Enlightenment perspective, that if you really want to take it back, it dates at least to that sense, that historical period when people began realizing agency and autonomy. I suppose there are also people who take it back even further. But I think in the Western life, that sense of personal responsibility did come out of that period. I think it's gotten, more and more central to our identities, in the last 100 or 200 years under capitalism. But anyone here who knows church history probably could say this better than I can. But I think in most religions before Protestantism, at least in theory, there was a much more cohesive community sense. And for better or for worse, people thought of themselves as social solidarities. And the big movement of, and this is just Western civilization, I'm not even speaking about the rest of the world. But Protestantism really, I guess Protestantism would take it back before the Enlightenment, but Protestantism really helped give people a sense of self that was not typical of Judaism or Catholicism, the other Western religions, which were more communal. But the emphasis on, that's what I was referring to when I said I could get into a whole theological explanation of this.
The Calvinist work ethic.
But also sola scriptura, the idea everyone has the ability to read the Bible for themselves. You don't need anyone to translate for you. That gives the individual a lot of agency. And I think that's part of it also. So, yes, if you know your next neighbor, you can understand that. But I think it's as theological as anything else. But I'm biased. I know, it's sort of weird when you think about it, because we're so Western-centric, it's hard to realize other societies may have done it differently in ways that were more hospitable to human development and social solidarity, but we've been unable to really see that, unfortunately.
One more question.
Hi, thank you for taking the time to come here today. So I was really interested when...
Come here and freeze.
Yeah, I would love to be in LA right now. But I was really interested in the fact that you said that you think that this starts in 1917 with the Bolshevik Revolution. And I think that's really interesting to me because I see the modern sort of movement around Trumpism as something that's not particularly ideologically cohesive, but more something that's more basic, like the idea that people are losing power. And to me, that's not something that starts at any specific time. That is something that's like integral to human nature. And so, and this also powers, Reagan's election in terms of, people feel like they don't have control of their destiny because inflation's really high, unemployment's really high. They can't have, life is just not keeping up with them. And so I was wondering, like, why are you specifically pinmarking 1917? And when do you think about that?
Yeah, I guess maybe I need to be clear about this. I don't think Trumpism or Reaganism began in 1917. I think in this country, the coalition of right-wing politicians, businessmen, and religious leaders began in 1917. And I'm saying that sort of led to what we would call Christian nationalism or conservative Christianity. And I'm saying that because it is documented that these groups, that these leaders came together and talked about this problem and began, thinking up initiatives and programs and doing literature to try to get people to understand the threat to democracy, capitalism, and Christianity. So I'm not saying that is wound up giving us Reagan and Trump. What I say in the book is that basically gave us a base of conservative voters who resonated with Reagan in 1980 and are still resonating with Trump today. But I'm not saying it was a direct line from here to there. Does that make sense to you? I think people, we tend to be very short-minded in our history of things, which is why saying something goes back to 1917 seems a lot. When maybe students at BC are better than my students at USC, but my students at USC have, trouble remembering what happened 2 weeks ago. So, oftentimes, it's hard to remember that most of the problems we deal with in the world today have a long tail.
Just a specific comment. I just thought of something. Bruce Barton, who, Jesus as
Business.
Nobody knows.
right, the business leader, not some soft, wimpy, I care about people. He was a strong business leader. And that's right, the era that you're talking about. That's a specific example, I think, of what you're talking about.
Yeah. And I don't want to let Catholics off the hook on this and blame everything on the Protestants, because Reagan had a very strong backing among conservative Catholics. William Buckley was really a big cheerleader for him. But there were other Catholics at the time who gave him a lot of support, who made this possible. It's interesting because I've been thinking lately that I really would like to know more about the role of Catholics in the Christian right and right-wing nationalism. Yeah, because I think that's really understudied and under-discussed. But it's also true that at this point, right-wing Christian nationalism is just not white people. There are lots of Asian people, lots of black people, lots of Jewish people. It just cuts across the whole spectrum now. And it is predominantly a white Christian movement, but it's not limited to just white people. And I do think, well, look at Vance. I think that Catholics are a significant part of that new wave of thinking, or that old wave of thinking.
Please join me in thanking Diane.